Authentic is sponsored in whole by Voice of Prophecy.
Today on Authentic, we're going to talk about religious faith. What is faith and what faith isn't? And in particular, I want to deal today with the supernatural. I'm going to talk about miracles. And I think I might just have some surprises for you, whether you happen to be religious or not.
Welcome to Authentic. Shawn Boonstra explores real existential questions about the meaning of your life and how you can live a genuine human existence. Listen every week right here on this station or on your favorite podcatcher. Here's Shawn with this week's episode of Authentic.
Even though my life as a young college student would probably make you doubt this, I was actually raised in a church-going home. We went every Sunday. In fact, we went twice every Sunday. And one night a week after school, I had to go to catechism class where I was required to memorize this book, the Heidelberg Catechism, which is the confession of faith favored by Dutch Calvinists. And on top of all of that, going to church, going to catechism, I spent more than half of my elementary school career attending a private Christian school. So you can see that I spent most of my childhood immersed in the culture of Western Christianity. Now, at one point, when I was very young, I suddenly discovered that other kids around me were not Christian, and they didn't share my family's worldview. And I remember this one little kid who openly told me that God didn't exist. Well, there was just no way I was going to stand for this little heathen denying God to my face. So I set about the task of proving God's existence, the way that a lot of people kind of get their nose out of joint on social media these days when somebody challenges their faith and they suddenly want to prove those people wrong. Now, bear in mind in this story, I was probably 7, 8, 9 years old. And so my command of Christian apologetics was probably not very well developed. And I resorted to something that, some fully grown Christians resort to today when they're boxed into a corner by an unbeliever. They bring up the subject of miracles. Somehow we think that if we can prove the supernatural, if the people we're talking to can see God operating in real time, if we can show them something they've never seen before, then they're going to come around to our way of thinking. So it was back in the early 1970s, and we happened to be playing in an empty lot beside a church. And the church was probably the reason this discussion came up in the first place. I suddenly pointed to the gravel in the parking lot and I said to this unbelieving kid, listen, if God suddenly moves one of those rocks, without anybody touching it, and it's one of the big rocks so that the wind didn't move it, would you believe that God is real if that happened? Would that be enough for you? Well, of course, he decided that would be enough, because what little kid wouldn't like to see a levitating rock? And so there I proceeded to say a prayer while pointing at the rock in question like I was some kind of Jedi master summoning the Force. I was pointing at a rock and trying to make it move. And in my childlike mind, I was thinking about Moses parting the Red Sea, or Elijah raising the dead, or bringing down fire on top of Mount Carmel. And I was absolutely sure that for the sake of this unbelieving heathen little kid, God was going to do this for me. The rock was absolutely going to move. But much to my embarrassment, nothing happened. The rock didn't budge. And of course, my disappointment was pretty profound. Why in the world didn't God perform a miracle? Didn't he understand what was riding on this one little moment? Didn't he care whether or not this kid believed in him? Or a worse thought crossed my mind. Maybe God didn't care about me. Maybe he took a look at my sorry self trying to work miracles in a small town gravel parking lot and said, I'm just not going to do it for this kid. Maybe there was something wrong with me, because obviously I was no hero of the Christian faith. I was not destined to become a legend in the pages of church history. Now, of course, I didn't just give up at that point. It was early evening, and the sun had just set behind the horizon, and it was starting to get dark. So I did what any reasonable little kid would do. I bluffed. I faked it. I said to this kid, "See, did you see it move? It moved just a little bit. I told you God was real." Now, of course, I'm not really proud of that today, and I was just a little kid, maybe 9, younger, 7. I don't remember how old I was. But the reason I'm admitting this to you now is because, well, unfortunately, a lot of full-grown adults can identify with what I just described. You become so desperate for God to prove Himself that you're tempted to help Him along. Maybe it's the feeling of inadequacy when God doesn't do what you think He should be doing. Or maybe you know what it feels like to run out of answers and hope for a miracle as a kind of last resort. I don't know exactly what's going on in your life right now, but I suspect that there's something in the story I just told you that you can identify with because, well, it illustrates a very real human attitude. So I want to spend a few minutes today talking about miracles, because it seems to me that the existence or non-existence of the miraculous seems to be a place where a lot of people go and hang their hat when they're trying to validate, or for that matter, invalidate the existence of the God who appears in the pages of this book. On the one hand, you've got people who point to the miraculous, to the inexplicable, to prove that God is real. Then on the other hand, you've got people who read the stories of the Bible and they dismiss them as mere fairy tales. And those people will tell you, look, we all know the sun does not stand still in the sky. We all know water does not change into wine and the dead do not come back to life. But if you take an honest look at the Bible and you take the time to read the whole thing, and I mean read the whole thing, you quickly discover that this is really not a book about miracles. I mean, miracles are in here, that much is true. And what happens to your own perspective on the universe when you take the time to read this book really is a miracle in and of itself. This material changes people in inexplicable, miraculous ways, but overall, this book is not a continuous historical account of supernatural events. In fact, when you consider that the story of the Bible covers thousands of years, well, in that case, the miracles suddenly look like they're kind of few and far between. It's a little surprising. In fact, you have a roughly 400-year gap in the middle of the story between Malachi and Matthew, where basically nothing happens. That's really important to remember, because the case the Bible makes for God isn't based on the miraculous. Never forget that a miracle can easily be dismissed by a skeptic, which is what many of the Enlightenment philosophers did back in the 18th century, when the deification of human reason was all the rage. A miracle, these people argued, could be an optical illusion. It could be a magic trick, or it could just be a simple lack of understanding. We all know, for example, that stage magicians do not really pull rabbits out of thin air. And as far as the rationalists of the 18th century were concerned, the universe, for some inexplicable reason, the universe has immutable physical laws that cannot be broken, and the appearance of an exception to those rules, a miracle, would be nothing but an illusion. Now, I've got to take a little break, so I'm going to let the miracle of television and radio take care of you for a few brief moments, and I'll be right back after this.
Life can throw a lot at us. Sometimes we don't have all the answers. But that's where the Bible comes in. It's our guide to a more fulfilling life. Here at the Voice of Prophecy, we've created the Discover Bible Guides to be your guide to the Bible. They're designed to be simple, easy to use, and provide answers to many of life's toughest questions. And they're absolutely free. Sign up at BibleStudies.com today and start your journey of discovery.
This is Authentic with Shawn Boonstra and the Voice of Prophecy.
Contrary to the way that a lot of people think, the Bible doesn't really point to miracles as proof of God's existence. And the story of what happened with the people who experienced the miracles in this book, well, it's not a very convincing exhibit for those who think that miracles would actually convince somebody to believe in God, because this book has lots of stories of people who witnessed clearly supernatural events and they still rejected God. So let's go back today and look at some of the most noteworthy examples. I want to show you something. In the book of Exodus, we have the parting of the Red Sea, easily one of the most spectacular events in the Bible. I mean, that's the centerpiece for Cecil B. DeMille's The Ten Commandments. After God sends a series of plagues on the land of Egypt to convince the Egyptians it is time for these Israelites to go, God escorts His people down to the edge of the Red Sea into something that basically looks like a death trap. They could actually see the dust of the Egyptian army up on the horizon, because even though the plagues were a supernatural miracle that persuaded the Egyptians to let the slaves go, the effect was short-lived. And in a matter of days, the Egyptians changed their mind and decided, we're going to go get those slaves back. So here we have God's people between the devil and the deep blue sea, or I guess the Red Sea, and suddenly God drives back the waters of the sea and His people cross on dry land. Then when the Egyptians set foot in that same water, the waters come back and drown them. Then on the heels of that, God suddenly provides pure drinking water for hundreds of thousands of people in a place where there is no water. And He literally gives them bread from heaven. Then He shows up in person in a cloud of fire on top of Mount Sinai. And these people hear the very voice of God. The whole story is undeniably miraculous. So you would think that His people would be forever grateful, that their loyalty would be locked down forever. But that's not how it worked. Within days of these supernatural miracles, the children of Israel built a golden calf and they worshiped it. It's absolutely inconceivable. I mean, I would like to think if I saw what they saw, I'd be convinced. I would stay convinced forever. But I think you and I both know that is not quite how it works. In fact, some of you listening right now, some of you have seen things you can't explain. Some of you have experienced what appears to be divine intervention, and for a moment you had no doubt God must be real. It happens. But then let me ask you this, was that enough to keep you faithful for the rest of your life? I'm guessing the answer is no. And that's because, first of all, the story of the Bible is not a list of logical proofs that God is real, and secondly, it does not build its case on miracles. Let me give you another example. We see Jesus over in the Gospel of John literally raising a man from the dead. And surprisingly, that was not enough to convince His critics that He possessed power over life and death, that He must be the divine author of life. Let me show you from the story recorded in John chapter 11. This is the story of Lazarus, a good friend of Jesus who died from an illness, and Jesus in this story at this point is talking to His sister Martha. This is John 11 verse 40. Jesus said to her, "Did I not say to you that if you would believe, you would see the glory of God?" Now remember, this is the story of a miracle, and I want you to notice the order that Jesus suggests. First you believe, and then you see the miracle, not the other way around, verse 41. Then they took away the stone from the place where the dead man was lying. And Jesus lifted up His eyes and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. And I know that you always hear me, but because of the people who were standing by, I said this, that they may believe that you sent me." So Jesus does pray that people would choose to believe, but pay attention to what happens here, verse 43. Now when He had said these things, He cried with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come forth." And he who had died came out bound hand and foot with grave clothes, and his face was wrapped with a cloth. Jesus said to them, "Loose him and let him go. So now we have a dead man who's come back to life. And you'd think for sure that would be the clincher. I mean, how do you argue with that? How do you argue with dead people who come back to life? But watch what happens next, because this is really important. It's one simple statement now down in verse 53. It says, "Then, from that day on, they plotted to put him to death." So how do you explain that? You have a dead man who comes back from the dead, and these people that saw that still wanted to kill Jesus. It doesn't make sense. But it did make sense to Jesus. In fact, over in Luke chapter 16, that's what the Bible said would happen. Luke 16, verse 31. "But he said to him, if they do not hear Moses and the prophets, neither will they be persuaded, though one rise from the dead." Don't miss this. This is really important. If reading the Scriptures, I mean, that's what it means by Moses and the prophets. It means the Scriptures. If reading the Scriptures doesn't convince you, then a miracle's not going to convince you either. And that is straight from the mouth of Jesus, the greatest miracle worker of all time. That should give you pause for thought. If the Son of God doesn't think that miracles are the ultimate proof of God's existence, or a foolproof way to convince people to worship God, then why do you and I like to think that way? Now, to be sure, when Lazarus was resurrected, some people did believe, but a resurrection was not enough to convince Jesus' enemies to just leave him alone at that point. And don't forget, these enemies were the religious leaders of the day, people who professed to believe in God, people who said they believed in Messiah. But when faced with miraculous proof that Jesus was Messiah, they did the wrong thing. They actually wanted him dead. Truth be told, they felt threatened by Jesus' popularity, and their personal ambitions quickly and very easily overrode any part of their brains that told them that Jesus was everything he claimed to be. Now, from my perspective, people don't come back from the dead. So you would think that a resurrection would be a game changer, but honestly, it's not. And really, it probably wouldn't be for most of us. Now, that's not to say that miracles don't happen. They really, really do. I've met people whose lives have been completely revolutionized by miraculous circumstances that can't be explained. But for most of us, surprisingly, a miracle is not enough. So, I do have to take another short break, but don't you go away, because I'm about to serve up some more talk about miracles.
Here at the Voice of Prophecy, we're committed to creating top quality programming for the whole family, like our audio adventure series, Discovery Mountain. Discovery Mountain is a Bible-based program for kids of all ages. Your whole family will enjoy the faith-building stories from this small mountain summer camp and town. With 24 seasonal episodes every year and fresh content every week, there's always a new adventure just on the horizon. Check it out today at discoverymountain.com.
This is Authentic with Shawn Boonstra and the Voice of Prophecy.
So here's what I want you to really think about today, because many of you, if not most of you, have had your doubts about the reality of God from time to time. I mean, even longtime churchgoers, if they're honest, they'd have to admit we all have these moments. And the historical record demonstrates that miracles are not the way to resolve your doubts, not for most people. And I guess the reason I'm hammering this point today is because so many people, without ever really reading the Bible, assume that this book is written like Greek mythology, a book based on fantastic events, and it offers those fantastic events as proof for God's existence. But that's not the way the Bible is written. In fact, let me take you back to the opening chapter, and you'll notice something rather extraordinary. I don't want you to miss this. This is Genesis chapter 1, right at the top. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Now that in and of itself is a miracle. God just speaks and the universe pops into existence. But at the same time, serious Bible students have noticed there's a significant difference between that passage and the stories of pagan mythology. There really is no backstory here, no family of gods and demigods going to war with each other or living as part of the creation itself. This God, the Creator, exists outside of His creation. The gods of Mount Olympus may have had incredible powers, but still they were somewhat subject to the laws of the universe. So this book is a radically different account, and it suggests that somebody made this place intentionally with a purpose in mind. Then after he speaks a logical and orderly universe into existence, it states something really important down in verse 31. Then God saw everything that He had made, and indeed it was very good. So the evening and the morning were the sixth day. Don't miss the significance of this, because this is really important. The Bible begins by describing a physical world with light and dark and plant life and animal life, and of course, us, the human race. And when it's done, God says, this is very good. In fact, after every day of creation, He says, this is good, and when it's all finished, He says, this is very good. The implication is that the universe, the way it was created, that was the miracle where you and I were supposed to see God, right here in the real, natural, physical world. The world was good the way it was. So the supernatural miracles in this book are the exception, not the rule. And the way God speaks to us is through ordinary circumstances in ordinary lives. Now, to be sure, I have seen my share of miracles. I really have. But that is not the essential foundation of my relationship with God. The God of the Bible is a God of relationships, and most of the real estate in this book is occupied with how God relates to the human race inside our own world. This is the story of ordinary people living in a covenant relationship with an extraordinary God who created us as companions for Himself, in His image, with the ability to create things in our own little way, and the ability to exercise moral choice, and the ability to love. Then this book finishes with a warning not to base our choices on miracles at all. Again, I'm not saying miracles don't happen, and I'm not saying they're not important, because obviously they are, or they wouldn't be in this book at all. What I'm saying is that they can't be the foundation for faith, because that's going to take you in the wrong direction. I'll show you what I mean from the book of Revelation. Now, most people think Revelation is obscure and mystical, but honestly, it's a book that's fairly easy to understand, and it actually offers answers to the deepest questions most of us have asked. Let me show you just one interesting thought from Revelation. This is describing the mess that human beings make when we try to take over God's throne and run the planet our way. Here's what it says in Revelation 13, verse 11. Then I saw another beast coming up out of the earth, and he had two horns like a lamb and spoke like a dragon. And he exercises all the authority of the first beast in his presence, and causes the earth and those who dwell in it to worship the first beast, whose deadly wound was healed. So here we have a description of people worshiping the wrong thing. Verse 13. He performs great signs, those are miracles, so that he even makes fire come down from heaven on the earth in the sight of men, and he deceives those who dwell on the earth by those signs which he was granted to do in the sight of the beast, telling those who dwell on the earth to make an image to the beast who was wounded by the sword and lived. So here's the problem with miracles. They can cut both ways. A supernatural event might be God's work, but then again it might not be. It might be somebody or something other than God, and so you want to be careful. This is why the faith of the Bible is not established on miracles. The famous Jewish philosopher Maimonides actually figured this out a long time ago. He noticed that when God performs miracles, He's generally, not always, but generally addressing real physical needs. He's not trying to prove His existence. He's trying to save His people from attack or provide food when they're hungry, and it primarily happens with people who already know that He exists. What the Bible urges us to do is not make a list of all the philosophical proofs for the existence of God. This book just challenges us to experience Him. All of us are born, after all, with this sense that something or someone is out there. And what the Bible urges us to do is experience God's presence in our daily, ordinary lives. This asks us to look for His presence and then become God's hands in a world that needs to see Him. In other words, you need to be the miracle in other people's lives. That's how people are going to see Him. God isn't looking to prove He exists, and He's not trying to wow you with His power. What He's asking you to do is experience Him, have a relationship with Him. That's the reason we crave things like friendship and love. We were made that way by a God who wants the same things. This is not some cold scientific God who deals in logical assertions. This is a God who loves to work with very imperfect people, keeping His promises when we break ours, showing us who He is through an ordinary day-to-day experience. Don't go away. I'll be right back.
Dragons, beasts, cryptic statues. If you've ever read Daniel or Revelation and come away scratching your head, you're not alone. Voice of Prophecy's free Focus on Prophecy guides are designed to help you unlock the prophetic mysteries of the Bible and deepen your understanding of God's plan for you and the world around you. You can study online or request them by mail. Visit BibleStudies.com and start bringing prophecy into focus today.
Welcome back. It's Authentic with Shawn Boonstra and the Voice of Prophecy.
Miracles are not the essence of a meaningful relationship with God, any more than a special occasion like your anniversary is the essential foundation of your marriage. Yeah, there are spectacular moments, but it's the stuff between the spectacular moments that makes for a lifetime of relationship. Over the years, I've seen some things I can't explain, but that's not what keeps me going day in and day out. What keeps me going are those quiet moments with God where I can open this ancient book and just listen to what He says. The supernatural stuff, think of that like icing on the cake. It's not the bulk of your experience. I know all around the world, Christians have made a huge fuss when miracles appear to happen, but it's entirely possible you could get to the end of your life and never actually see one, and that's okay. It doesn't mean that God isn't real or that He doesn't know you're there. It certainly doesn't mean that something is wrong with you. It just means you live the biggest miracle of all, a peaceful life with God in a very broken world. And just like it was with the prophet Elijah, I think you'll be amazed just how often God chooses to speak, not in a spectacular storm, but in a still small voice, a voice you can still find in the pages of this book. Thanks for joining me. I'm Shawn Boonstra, and this has been Authentic.
You've been listening to Authentic, sponsored by Voice of Prophecy. Remember, you can listen every week right here at the same time. And thank you. Authentic is funded by listeners just like you. You can support at voiceofprophecy.com. That's also where you can find all the episodes you missed, or where you can listen again. That's voiceofprophecy.com.